funny because I don't actually think of the States so much as my home country. I think of New York as my adopted city. But if, when the Olympics roll around, I root for Team Canada, certainly, and kind of despise Team USA. So I feel patriotic about New York. I'm not sure, I don't know that you can feel patriotic about any unit much larger than a city. And if that's true, I certainly feel patriotic about Montreal.
An American raised in Montreal, Adam Gopnik has written for the New Yorker magazine since 1986. He's the author of several books, including the highly acclaimed Paris to the Moon. He's the winner of 3 National Magazine Awards, and he's regularly the smartest guy in the room. We met him at a bar in New York, where he maintained that distinction without breaking a sweat.
I was going to ask what you wanted to talk about, simply because in 40 years of doing interviews, I've always wanted to ask start an interview by saying, so what do you want to talk about? And I figured you'd be the perfect person to ask.
Absolutely, no, I'd be glad to take that.
But in fact, there are some things that I want to ask you about. And I guess I wanted to start by talking about your growing up in Montreal and how you're American by birth, born in Philadelphia, and then raised in Montreal.
That's right.
Your parents were at McGill.
They were at McGill. They went to teach. Well, actually, my mother went to teach at the University of Montreal, Université de Montréal, as we should say. And my dad at McGill, but then my mother went to McGill within a couple of years.
How does that period of time going up there inform you the rest of your life now that you're back in your home country? And
well, it's funny because I don't actually think of the States so much as my home country. I think of New York as my adopted city. But if, when the Olympics roll around, I root for Team Canada, certainly, and kind of despise Team USA. So I feel patriotic about New York. I'm not sure, I don't know that you can feel patriotic about any unit much larger than a city. And if that's true, I certainly feel patriotic about Montreal.
Yeah.
I loved and love still Montreal. I think of it as my hometown very strongly, even though my family is largely leached away from there. How did it affect me? How does it affect me now? In all the the multitude of immediate and practical ways. I learned French there. I learned to speak French and to read French, and that changed my life in lots of ways.
Yes.
I learned to have a good sense of humor about living in a paranoid, monolingual French community. That was no small thing, and with a heavy overdose of bureaucracy. That was a good preparation for living in France.
Yes.
I developed many loves that have stuck with me for a long time. Ice hockey and true bagels, smoked meat, and good food, and my wife, who's a pure Montreal girl, born at the Jewish General, an Icelandic Canadian girl. All of those things. I guess at a deeper level, sort of the kind of sedimentary level of life, Montreal always seemed to me, at least when I was growing up there, with all the difficulties it presented, something close to an ideal city. It was an immensely civil place in every way. People of fundamentally different backgrounds and ethnic kinds, on the whole, lived together communally. And even despite the great fundamental left-right Anglo-Franco split, that city could come together around common affections and common causes. And for me, I love cities, really, really love cities. Can't imagine living outside a city. So in that way, Montreal still resides someplace in the back of my brain as, if not an ideal, then at least somehow a kind of perfectly representative city.
Was writing what you always wanted to do?
Always. I can never remember a time in my life when I didn't want to be a writer. I mean, I wanted to be some of the intermediate things that kids want to be, not even that. I say that by rote, and then I stopped thinking that's not even true. I never wanted to be anything but a writer. I mean, I would have loved to have become a hockey player or a rock star, but that was never a serious possibility or for a vocation. The only thing that ever altered was that I wanted to be a songwriter, a guy who writes lyrics for songs, and then an essayist and all of those things. But essentially, I'd wanted to write for the New Yorker magazine in particular since I was about 6.
Really?
Yeah. My dad is a wonderful reader, and he had, as is my mom, and he had the Thurber Carnival, James Thurber's wonderful collection of pieces. And I literally read it to pieces when I was 6 or 7. I don't really think I fully understood its content at that time, but I entirely grasped its tone, and I loved that tone. And I truly read it to pieces in bed, and I understood from the introduction, from the preface, that this had all appeared in the New Yorker, and I thought, oh, that's a good job.
Now, one of the things that's been often said about you in pieces that I've read is that you are someone with a seemingly insatiable curiosity about things, which I have to assume was instilled in you by your parents. Is that true?
It's certainly true that I grew up in a very large, very argumentative, very ambitious, secularized Jewish, Catholic, some kind of weird combo. When I say Catholic, I don't mean literally Catholic.
Yeah.
I just mean that, my father was a professor of English, so all of the poetry that he most loved came out of that kind of Anglo-Catholic tradition, Donne and Herbert and so on. So that was certainly true. Henry James said once that the only country, you asked me, what country do you feel you belong to? And he said, the only country I belong to is the James family. And I have a slight feeling that way about the Gopnik family. That's the country I feel at home in. And it was like a country. It was, it had lots of people, a couple of languages, and a lot of internecine warfare among them that never quite broke out into full-fledged violent civil war. Though it threatened to a couple of times. So, yes, that's true. But, it's funny because people say that, and it's a compliment, and I appreciate it. But I don't think I have all that vast a line of curiosity.
Really?
No, I think that I have sort of the standard curiosities that of almost anybody who's a sort of newspaper reading, television watching, sports loving human being is at the beginning of the 21st century. I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in history. I'm very interested in sports. I love pop music. And I think the reason that people get that impression, if I wrote with authority about string theory or subatomic physics as well as French culture, then you could say that guy's got a wide range of interest. But I really think that what I have is sort of the standard interests of a normal, intelligent, semi-educated person at this time. What I do think, and I'll say this without false modesty, I have is the ability to organize those kinds of standard interests into stories, into pieces, into writing. I have a gift for reading a lot and absorbing it quickly, but as far from thinking that it's the range of what I do that's sort of interesting, it's the sort of the narrowness of what I do, I suspect, is what people are actually responding to. The thing, say, I'm interested in that, right? That's, I think, a lot of what you're trying to do with writing is not so much to say, let me tell you about something you don't know, but more, that thing you're interested in? Did Jesus ever actually exist? What the F was Albert Camus all about, really? Those are the kinds of questions that we all sort of ask. And I say, oh, that interests me too. Let me try. Yeah. Let me have a go at that.
I'm interested in the confluence of just straight journalistic practice, and then the skill of the essayist. Because I have in my hand here your book Paris to the Moon, which is the essays are fabulous, and I laugh out loud practically all the way as I'm reading it all the time. But I can't help but thinking, okay, these are really good essays. But there's also a journalist at work here, because a lot of the information you have to go and dig out. When you're talking about French cuisine and you're talking about one particular restaurant, you have the names, and not only the names and the ages, but the hidden desires of the chef and the sous chef and the guy who's cutting up the potatoes. So you got to do that groundwork.
I've always disliked the word journalist. I don't know why, because a journalist for me is always somebody who's sort of on the news, right? What's the news today? Mitt Romney is talking about something. But I love the idea of being a reporter.
Right.
That was a great breakthrough in my life when I left graduate school and was able to work as a reporter at the New Yorker, writing the old talk of the town. And being a reporter is a wonderful thing. Being a reporter is sort of inherently poetic because you're going into new worlds, you're opening doors, and you're walking into all these little subcultures. Being a journalist is sort of decrepit as a thing, because basically you're trailing after a story with a pack of 500 other people. Being a reporter, I always love. And I learned, to the degree that I learned it at all, I learned something about the craft of reporting when I went to the New Yorker, when I finally got out of graduate school and began doing what I actually wanted to do. No one was stopping me but me. And as I say, for 5 years I wrote the talk of the town, and I had my notebook and my pencil, and more important than that, my ears, and you learn to listen. And I had wonderful kind of immediate mentors, New Yorker writers such as Alec Wilkinson, Mark Singer, Calvin Trillin, to use as models. And I realized that being a reporter is a beautiful thing in and of itself. And as I said a moment ago, it's a sort of poetic thing in the sense that it's all about selection. It's about listening and selecting. And it's a way of sort of drawing small, reliable cartoons, accurate cartoons of the world around you, because you can't put in everything when you're a reporter.
Right.
You have to put in a few strong, broad strokes, but they have to be true. They have to be accurate. And I love that. And that's when I really learned that craft. And I still get this enormous sense of release and pleasure and fun if I'm on the subway, on my way somewhere, with my spiral notebook in my hand to go out and report something.
Huh. How disciplined are you in terms of your writing? Are you rigorous about the period of time, the actual writing? Yeah.
Yeah, I am. That's the one thing I did learn, and I think everybody has to learn. It's a cliche, but true, that the difference between people who want to write and people who write is simple application. Mm-hmm. And I remember when it happened to me, I had always wanted to be a writer, but I had always been a sort of sporadic, off and on producer. Writing a lot. I wrote a spy novel when I was about 9 or 10. It was 56 pages long, which I thought was like the length of Finnegan's Wake. It's amazing, monumental, voluminous thing. But I moved to New York. Bus from Montreal, it said New York City on the front from Place des Armes. What was that? Yeah, that was where the bus station was, with my girlfriend. And we came down here. We rented a tiny, tiny room, about 9 by 11. And I'm not exaggerating. It was one 9 by 11 room. And I sat there with a typewriter. And I remember sort of the day, it was in the winter, that first winter we were there, when the task of writing passed from being inside my head as a set of ambitions and sort of revolving fragmentary sentences and settled in my stomach as a set of physical exercises. Because that's what writing really is. Writing is like riding a bicycle. It's like climbing a mountain. It's if you can settle it in your stomach instead of your head will look after itself. Your head is plenty smart enough, or not, but it can do its own work. But you have to translate it into this physical task. And once you've done that, it becomes both necessary discipline and a little bit addictive. So now I can't... I start writing after the kids are at school, 8:30 or 9.
Every day?
I write every day,
yeah.
Saturdays and Sundays included. And I write usually about 5 hours. I write from 9 till 2 most days. Okay. And one of my many sisters, all of whom have PhDs except me, in the family, said to me once that it's an absolute rule, psychological rule, that you can only do a high-focus task for 4 hours at a time. You can't hope to do it for more than that. So the 5th hour is sort of lollygagging, I think.
Tell me just how you actually ended up getting hired at the New Yorker. I mean, it was something you wanted since the age of 6. Right. How did it come about?
I had been submitting pieces. I mean, when I say submitting, I mean sliding under the door every week, having walked down to the old offices for a long time, 4 or 5 years. And then a wonderful editor named Chip McGrath got you know how that is. People start paying attention to you. Go away, go away, go away. Well, this one's not so bad, but it's not right for us. But go away, go away, go away. It's kind of interesting, this one. So finally, after 6 years, my friend Malcolm Gladwell, fellow Canadian, has that thing about 10,000 hours, right? He's made famous that you work for 10,000 hours. You're the Beatles in Hamburg or whatever. You do 10,000 hours and you make it. My son came to me about 2 years ago and said, "Do you believe this thing that Malcolm's about 10,000 hours?" And I said, well, I love Malcolm like a brother, but, he may be shading it a bit. And he said, "Well, when was your 10,000 hours, Dad?" And I sat down and thought, well, I really started writing seriously in the fall of 1980 when we arrived in New York, and I had that transformation from the mental task to the physical task. And I worked all that time, 2 weeks a year. I would take off in Montreal at home. So we did the calculations, and it got me to 10,000 hours exactly in May of 1986, which was when my first piece appeared in the New Yorker. So I called Malcolm and said, "Son of a bitch, you won't believe this." But the truth is, as Malcolm himself would be the first to say, 10,000 hours is 6 years, and 6 years is what it takes you to master pretty much anything. You go to law school, 4 years, and then 2 years after. Medical school, 4 years in school, and then 2 years as an intern or resident. And so that was my 10,000 hours, my 6 years. So finally, Chip McGrath, in my 6th year of submitting, took a piece of mine about the Expos. Actually, it's called Quattrocento Baseball, about loving being an art historian, which is what I was supposedly training to do, and being an Expos fan. And then they took another piece and another, and then I got hired in February of 1987, exactly 25 years ago, to be a full-time staff writer.
Do you remember the first day at the office?
Oh, sure. Oh, of course, yeah.
Scary stuff? Nerve-wracking for you? Or did
well,
you
it was
feel
a time.
good?
Yes, it was terrifying, terrifying and gratifying.
Yeah.
Time of transition. A new editor had come in, and so there was some tension around that. But essentially, my experience of it was that it was like walking into this uncanny advent calendar. You know, those advent calendars, you open a little window and you peek inside. And in those days, the kind of decorum of the magazine was that everybody kept their doors shut. All the writers were in residence in those days, were on staff, with their doors shut. And you could knock, 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 come in. And you'd open the door, and it would be Roger Angell or Calvin Tompkins or Calvin Trillin or Joseph Mitchell, people who were, in many respects, you had read and admired your whole life, or in Mitchell's case, for instance, were legends, were people, Mitchell, who was I think one of the three greatest of all New Yorker writers, who had not published anything since 1961. But he was in there looking as though he hadn't moved since 1961 in a fedora and a beautiful three-piece suit, or actually it was a vest and then a jacket, and it looked like he hadn't moved since 1961, looked like he hadn't moved since 1941. And so you would have, so that was an amazing day. That was a wonderful day. And I went to work to write a Talk of the Town story. So yeah, I remember that day very well.
I have to ask you about the 5 years you spent in France. Again, making a reference back to this book. By the way, as an aside here, before I do that, when you were mentioning Malcolm Gladwell, I had just recently read the entire transcript of a debate that you and he had in 2000 about healthcare.
Yes, that's right.
And it was strange because I read it and I had to go back and look at the date that you'd had it because, seriously, it's the same argument. They are the same arguments that are going on now, and it's 12 years later.
Well, to do Malcolm justice, though, Malcolm has since had a massive conversion experience.
Oh, has he?
In the Canadian direction. He wrote a very good piece, sort of confessing his errors, and like a good, like in China, in Mao's period, practicing self-criticism and confessing his errors and going in for re-education. But I think he's come to accept that the libertarian model just doesn't work when it comes to healthcare. Yeah. But that was it was a good argument. It
was a great piece. Now to go back to Paris to the Moon, I made a note of one line in the book that I thought summed up so much of what you were saying about France and the country and everything it stands for. You wrote, "French civilization is all the more a miracle given the obstacles the French put in its way."
Yeah, that isn't a bad summary of the whole book. Yes, I had forgotten that line, but yes, that's right.
That was a series of pieces that were done for the New Yorker, right? So you were basically their Paris correspondent.
Yeah, except it wasn't so much, it wasn't as though somebody, when David Remnick went to Moscow for the Washington Post, they had a Moscow office and it needed to be filled, and David, who was a sports writer, put in for it, and because he was so gifted, got it, and it changed his life. It's when he really discovered himself as a writer and a reporter. With me, it was a little different because we didn't really have it. It wasn't a job that was there. It was a passion of mine. My wife and I wanted to live in France. We wanted to live in Paris. We didn't want to live in France. And we just had a baby, Luke. And so we wanted to go there. And I think at the time, Tina Brown, who was the editor, frankly was a little skeptical if there was anything worth writing there, because at that moment in the mid-'90s, if you recall, it was at the height of Cool Britannia, just before Tony Blair became prime minister, at a moment when, quite credibly, quite rightly, London seemed to be becoming the capital, not just of Europe, but in some ways of the world. So Paris, by contrast, seemed like a very quaint backwater. And that wasn't a false perception about Paris in those days. What fascinated me, though, was exactly its backwaterness, that here was the last place that was really resistant to the imperium of Anglo-American culture that was sweeping the world. Very much like the beginning of the great Asterix books, those wonderful bande dessinée. Yes. Mm-hmm. All of the world is in the Roman Empire with the exception of one little Gaulish town. Well, Paris was that one little Gaulish town in the most literal and in the most richly symbolic sense. It was the place that was resisting the American imperium at a time when London was falling to it and bettering it and improving on it. So that was what, it was a more idiosyncratic ambition, though of course it became a regular job. And I was reporting from Paris. I reported from Paris those 5 years. I wrote a lot of stuff that was sort of much more dutiful bread and butter reporting. Princesses were killed and prime ministers fell and all of that stuff that I didn't put in the book.
Okay. I want to ask you about food too, because, and again, there's a great section in this book, one of the essays about the crisis of French
cooking,
cuisine, right. and you have written another book now about the table, right. and what sitting at a table with a family means, right. in on so many levels.
The table comes first. Let's give it its title.
Table comes first. I was thinking as I was reading the French cuisine piece, there was a book out a few years ago by the guy who's now and might have been then the restaurant critic at the Observer, a guy named Jay Rayner. It was a book called The Apologist.
Yes.
I don't know if you ever read it or not, but it was about a food critic who criticizes the chef so severely that the chef commits suicide and he has to go and apologize to the wife, and then he ends up apologizing at the UN and for every wrong done around the world. But the review was something like the food tasted better coming up than it did going down, or something along those lines. I was thinking about that because of the way this guy wrote about food, but it was British food he was writing about, British restaurants, and the way that you wrote about them. And you seemed, I know that you like to cook, and you have said often enough that your mother loved to cook, and that was in your background. But you seem to have thrown yourself into French cuisine into the deep end.
In a deeply embarrassing and amateurish way. Well, it's
hardly
as simple as that Martha, my wife, and I, were kind of young people, callow, superficial young people in New York. We went out to eat a lot. We lived in Soho. And when you have a kid, you can't really do it that much. So, you sort of have to cook more than you would wanted to. But I did love, a little bit of, I had to learn the craft of it for that reason, the way women have for a millennium. But I think some part of it was, too, is that I love French civilization. That's the subject of that book, and that was the subject of my writing more than politics or the passing scene. So there is no better embodiment, no better representative, no better exemplar of everything that goes on in French civilization than its cooking. And it almost interests me more as civilization than as sensation. Because it's a weird thing, because I'm not really like a fussy food guy in that way, and I always find it sort of depressing when you're going to Paris or someone says, oh, you must try l'Estrance, or you must try Kamchatka or something. Because I don't really want to go to sort of new places. It's not about that kind of sensation, tongue taste, mouth taste for me. For me, food is a moral taste before it's a mouth taste. And I love the feeling of sitting in the same places I love and watching this old civilization coalesce around me. That's the appeal of it.
And it is so much more, for France, it's always seemed to me, cuisine is so much more a centerpiece of their civilization in that country than probably anywhere else, I would think.
Well, one reason is because what is civilization? Civilization is giving grace to the unnecessary. I said in one point in the book, I'm talking about why I like this brasserie called the Balzar, which was being bought by a big chain. And it was because every time when you went for dinner, they would bring whatever it was, the gigot with beans, to your place on an oval platter and then transfer it to a round plate. Now, it was exactly the same dish, right, or the steak and frite, but this act of transferring from the oval platter to the round plate was essential to the service. And as I said, it restored my faith in the necessity of superfluous civilization. And civilization is in its essence superfluous. It's, all of us eat. We can eat on the floor with our fingers if we want to, but we transform that physical need, that animal need, if you like, into a complicated social ritual. Yeah. That's what civilization's about. And for me, that's what the civilization of French cooking is about.
We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you, staying with food, as long as we're here, I note that, when by the time people see this, it will have come and gone, but you will be speaking at Luminato in Toronto, and I note that you will be speaking on the subject of Canadian cuisine.
Canadian cuisine, exactly.
Could you elaborate, Mr. Gopnik, please?
I haven't actually worked out my notes yet on this subject. I think Calvin Trillin, a wonderful writer, and I are going to be, to whom my food book is dedicated, are going to be taking it on. I'm going to approach it, since you asked, on sort of two different levels. One is sort of folk Canadian cuisine. Those are the things that we all love. Montreal smoked meat, Montreal bagels, I say as a patriotic Montrealer. Poutine can keep. I always think poutine is sort of like, it's like what? It's like sauerkraut. It's not something people really, and nobody really likes poutine, but it's a cool thing to show off to the strangers. Like eyeball soup in China. Nobody really likes eyeball soup, but they like to freak out the visitors, and we freak out visitors with poutine. But sugar pie, maple syrup, ice wine. Those are all real things. But what I was going to say is, so there's that stuff, kind of folk Canadian cuisine. Right. But then there's the newly emerging Canadian cuisine. When I was growing up, Canadian wine was kind of a joke. right? You couldn't. That's the coercive Canadian right. I can ask me about that. Didn't really. If somebody offered you Canadian wine, you sort of made a face and tried to be polite.
That's right.
Now I was in Toronto, well, really right across the country, doing the Massey Lecture Tour, and everywhere you went, you had first-rate Canadian wine, white above all and sparkling, but good red wine too, good Pinot Noir from Niagara, and that was a revelation to me. That's a combination of climate change, I suppose, but also a new artisanal appreciation of it. And you get great Canadian food. That was one of the nicest parts of the Massey Lecture Tour for me, was that everybody on the tour, kind of little touring party, lived for their stomachs. And everywhere we went, we ate really well. In Halifax, in Edmonton, in Vancouver, of course, above all. I thought Vancouver I could move to tomorrow, because they have, between the oysters and the local wine and we're eating the game, just fantastic.
Yes. All right, we had about 2 minutes left, so I'll ask you finally, and that was an interesting example of it right there. You're going to have to do this in a couple of months.
Right.
You've got to work out some kind of logical progression and convincing argument one way or another for it. And is that very often what you have to do when you're approaching any one of the essays that you're going to do? You pick, you know what it is you want to go after, and then you've got to formulate your...
Sure. You're searching to create a spurious surface of plausibility while treading water desperately just to remain conscious. Yeah, that's part of what essay writing is, especially when you write for a weekly magazine. So yes, that's part of, your mind is churning all the time.
Yeah.
How am I going to make this material into a narrative? That's what a writer does. He takes, it's like shooting a documentary. You're constantly photographing.
And subject matter is always comes from you, or do sometimes somebody suggests
something?
Sometimes
somebody suggests things, but they sort of know what I'm interested in. But most of the time it comes from me, and most of the time it comes out of whatever my current obsession is. I hated dogs. Hated dogs. My 10-year-old daughter backed us into a corner of a pet store for a dog. And then we had a dog, and all I would talk about at the office for the next few weeks is kind of interesting having this dog around. It's so weird. We're these primates, and they're these little canines, and yet they're running us. This is a scam that they've worked out over. And my editor said, stop talking about this and write this, because you're talking about it as though it's obsessive. And so I always try and come out of that obsession. But sure, I just did, I had to write Comment, the little editorial that leads off the magazine this week. And it was sort of a hole that had to be filled. What can I possibly say? And I had been joking with my wife, who's a big Mad Men fan, this is our whole family, about the reason that we're always attracted to things that are just 40 years earlier than our own time. And I had a theory for it. It's because the people who actually, not the artists who make things, but the programmers, producers, the suits who put things on the air or in movies are always 40 to 50. So that's the time that fascinates them, just before they were born. And I thought, well, I could write that up. If it's sort of like skating across thin ice. I don't know how plausible I can make it for how long, but if I can get from word 1 to word 800, I'll have a piece. And that's part of the fun of it. That's part of the fun, is to throw a little conceit, a jeu d'esprit, as the French say, out into the world. And if there's anything I regret, I don't care for in the way the world is tending, it's that people have become incredibly literal-minded readers. And that sense of fun, that it's possible for something to be simultaneously serious and unserious, seems to be vanishing from the world.
It does. I think we can probably thank the internet for a lot of that.
Exactly so.
We've run short of time. I could talk to you for hours. This is great. I really appreciate you doing that. It was great to meet you. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Thanks.